In the early 1900s, a Canadian clergyman and his wife faced a harrowing ordeal while crossing the ice bridge over the St. Lawrence River. As the ice beneath them gave way, they found themselves drifting on a small ice floe, seemingly headed towards certain death. Reverend Mr. Armstrong and his family were well liked and respected in Point Levis, a charming town on a hill opposite Quebec City. Before modern bridges and reliable ferries, Point Levis was Quebec's main link to the east and west, making it a vital place. The story of how Mr. Armstrong and his wife were swept away on the ice was one he often recounted. Here, I'll share it in his own words, but first, a bit about the ice bridge. This naturally occurring bridge between Quebec and Point Levis would form in two ways. When the water froze smoothly, it created a solid flat surface, perfect for driving, walking, or even skating. But if it froze during a storm, it created a rough jam bridge full of bumps that made travel difficult. Nowadays, the ice bridge doesn't form every year. Modern infrastructure like the Quebec Bridge and the Pierre-Laporte Bridge provide reliable, year-round connections between Quebec City and Levis, eliminating the need for an ice bridge. Ferry services now operate year-round, even in winter, thanks to ice-breaking technology. In early April, Mr. Armstrong and his wife left their home in Pine Cliff, Point Levis, to cross to Quebec. Now, let me tell the story in his own words. On the day we crossed, or attempted to cross, to Quebec, we'd been invited to a large banquet. We left Pine Cliff about noon. The day was beautiful, with just enough frost in the air to make driving agreeable. The roads leading to the river, however, were absolutely atrocious, slushy and full of bumps, and Robin, our old nag, was rather nervous. In fact, I practically led the horse all the way down the steep hill towards the river. On the way, we met the priest, and stopped to exclaim at the badness of the roads. "Are you not going to the dinner tonight?" I asked. He shook his head. "I'm afraid to risk the crossing," he replied. "The ice is not very good now, and as I shall have to return home late at night, I've given up the idea. Surely you're not returning tonight with Madame Armstrong? I'm sure it would not be safe." We smilingly replied, "No," and went on. About a yard or two further on, we heard his voice again, shouting a warning. "Be very careful. There are several nasty places in the bridge," he cried, and we said we would. By this time it was about 1 o'clock, the state of the roads making it necessary to proceed at no more than a walking pace. Mrs. Armstrong began to be uneasy about the time we should arrive. "If we had taken so long to get to the river, how shall we ever reach Quebec in time?" she said. "You heard what the priest said. I do hope there'll be no accident on the ice." I laughed at my wife's fears. How often had we crossed the ice? Why, we had made hundreds of journeys during the 20 years since we left Old Scotia to find a home so many thousand miles away. I tried to comfort her, and at last she was quite herself again. By this time we had arrived at the river, and I drove carefully down to the ice, which was certainly very slushy. The poor horse was up to his ankles in water all the time and seemed anything but happy. To tell you the truth, by this time I was anything but happy myself. Looking across, I could only distinguish one sleigh rapidly nearing the opposite shore. There were also a few pedestrians in the distance, all on the Quebec side. I tried to appear cheerful, but it was with a heart full of misgivings that I began our crossing. Splash, splash went the horse's hooves in the wretchedly cold water. "Move on!" I cried, and poor Robin tried his best to go quicker, but in vain. The unfortunate beast must, I think now, have had some sort of premonition of what was going to happen. Slowly we proceeded over those horrible bumps. Would we ever get to the opposite shore, I thought. My wife by this time was quite cheerful again. She chatted about the evening's pleasure and was absolutely unconscious of any danger. I was only too thankful for this, for if we had to suffer, the longer she was in ignorance of our probable fate, the better. I tried to reply quite calmly to her remarks. Suddenly, my blood ran cold. I had seen a few yards from us a rift in the ice. On, good horse," I murmured under my breath. "Save us from a horrible death." The rift seemed to come nearer and nearer. I glanced at my wife, but happily, still unconscious of the terrible fate we were likely to meet, she was laughingly teasing me about the speed of our poor steed, who by this time was absolutely overcome by the fear of some approaching danger. I tried to answer her, but my lips were trembling, and my tongue felt too parched to utter a word. She turned suddenly to me. "What is the matter?" she cried. "Are you angry?" But the words died on her lips, for she told me afterwards my face was livid. Just at that moment, we heard a sound as if artillery were booming around us. The sleigh gave a sudden jerk and nearly slipped, but with a supreme effort, Robin dragged it out of the water circling around us. It was a most terrible moment. The ice bridge had broken up. We were left stranded on a piece of ice not much larger than the sleigh. I looked at my poor wife. She was deathly white, but in this moment of awful danger, her splendid courage reasserted itself. What could we do? Nothing at all, save allow ourselves to drift. If we were not rescued in time, and the piece of ice did not break, which was improbable, then it might be our fate to be carried after several days' misery right to the Gulf. I looked around. There was nothing to be seen but pieces of ice floating about us, some of which every now and then collided with our fragment and nearly precipitated the sleigh into the water, which seemed to seethe from the shock of the sudden breakup. There was nothing to be done. If we were fortunate enough to be carried near the south shore, where the current seemed likely to take us, there was a chance of our being rescued by some of the inhabitants. Yet that was almost impossible. How could any boat put out from the shore with masses of ice several feet deep crowding the river? It would be crushed to atoms and more lives lost. No, all that remained for us was to prepare for death. We had not spoken for several minutes, but I felt that my dear wife must be told of our probable fate. It was one of the most terrible moments of my life, when I had to say to the woman, who for over 20 years had been my devoted helpmate, that there was practically no hope. She was gazing around in every direction, frantically clutching at the sides of the sleigh whenever we collided with a floe. "Janet," I said, "do you know we are in great danger?" "Yes," she replied softly, almost in a whisper. "I can see no way of escape," I went on. "Nothing short of a miracle can save us. My dear wife, that I should be the one to bring you into this awful danger." She looked up with one of her sweet smiles. "Dan," she said, "I am only too thankful that I am with you. I do not mind our dying together. The only thing that is making me unhappy is the thought of the children." Here her voice broke, and I heard the sound of suppressed sobs. I could not speak either. My eyes were filled with tears and my heart with anguish as I thought of our children, happily unconscious of their poor parents' fate. I had not long to indulge in vain regrets, however, for a larger piece of ice than we had before encountered dashed against us, and all but swamped us. Then I saw that there was only one thing to be done, and that was to sacrifice Robin, whose weight threatened to destroy us. Already our piece of ice was getting deeper into the water. It was a terrible thing to do, but I had no alternative. My wife was not strong enough to lie on the snow, and I must try to keep the sleigh for her. So overboard, the poor horse must go. I'm not ashamed to say that tears flowed down my cheeks as I loosened his harness for the last time. I suppose I was a fool, but before pushing him into the icy waters, I whispered in his ear, "I would not do this to save my own life, but it is for your mistress." Then I shut my eyes. I could not bear to see him drown. Fortunately, my wife by this time was in a sort of drowsy state. I did not see the last of the poor animal. I had covered her up as warmly as possible with buffalo robes, and presently, to my joy, she fell into a kind of troubled sleep. We were now nearing Indian Cove, but the place was shut up for the winter. I eagerly looked around in a vain hope that someone might be near, but there was no one to be seen. A little lower down, when we were not more than 200 or 300 yards from the shore, I saw a man standing there and waved frantically to him, but he evidently thought discretion the better part of valor, and though he saw us, he could or would do nothing to help us. Down, down we floated, sometimes fast, sometimes slowly, and occasionally we came to a complete standstill. I gazed around at the other pieces of ice when we were stationary in a wild hope of being able to walk ashore, but it was absolutely impossible. We had by this time reached the island of Orleans, where the river is narrower, and here I hoped that the looked-for help might be found. But to my horror, we began to move much more swiftly down the stream, and our piece of ice still seemed to be getting deeper in the water, which reached the interior of the sleigh. There was no help for it. We must let the sleigh follow poor Robin. Hastily arousing my wife, I wrapped her in the sleigh robes, and then pushed the sleigh into the river. How to describe those next few hours I do not know. We kept moving, moving onwards with the water rising slowly but relentlessly over our flow till at last both of us were soaked through with the icy fluid in which we crouched. Fortunately, I had my pipe, but as the evening approached, we both became hungry. My wife had rescued from the sleigh a cake which she had made for the children, and this we ate, but our condition was most miserable. Our teeth were chattering with cold, and we had given ourselves up for lost. While we could still see our danger, it seemed more bearable, but the darkness tended to lend new terrors to our awful situation, and clasping each other's hands, we prepared for the worst. To increase our misery, snow now began to fall, a blinding storm which cut our faces, and at each bump of our piece of ice we felt sure the end had arrived. At last, feeling no answering pressure from my wife's hand as I held hers, I lit a match to look at her face and found to my horror that she had dropped off to sleep. It was so cold by this time that I knew sleep would be fatal. She would be frozen to death, and I tried my best to rouse her. Her one idea, however, was to be left alone, and at last I was almost in despair when the sudden shock of our piece of ice grounding against some obstacle roused her, to my great delight, though at the same time I feared she would only be thoroughly awakened in another world. We waited in fear and trembling for what would happen next, but to our surprise the ice remained stationary. For the next 3 hours we sat there in the darkness, shivering with cold and terror, till at length the welcome beams of the morning sun showed us that we were aground on some land. Rising to our feet, we hastened ashore over the broken ice as quickly as we could in our stiff and frozen condition. Our clothes were so stiff with frost that we could hardly walk, but we forgot everything in the joy of being saved. There were no houses to be seen, so I persuaded my wife to wait for me while I reconnoitered. I had not gone more than half a mile when I came across a house, and rousing the occupants, told them my story. I then found that we had come ashore at St. Pierre, one of the parishes of the island of Orleans. The family was extremely kind, and immediately harnessed a horse to sleigh, in which we went to get my wife. We had soon exchanged our wet clothes for some homespun apparel belonging to our hosts, and I don't think we ever enjoyed a meal more in our lives than the one we had then, though it only consisted of some black bread and cheese, followed by curdled milk and maple sugar. It was 3 days before we managed to cross to the mainland, and when we arrived home, we were welcomed as though we had risen from the dead. Strange to say, neither of us felt any ill effects from our terrible 15 hours journey on the ice, but to my dying day, I shall never forget the horrors of that awful voyage. The story of Reverend Mr. Armstrong and his wife adrift on the icy St. Lawrence River not only highlights their survival, but also speaks to the theme of sacrifice. First, they sacrificed their horse, Robin, to lighten their load and increase their chances of survival. Then, faced with the sleigh threatening to sink their small ice floe, he sacrifices the sleigh, their only shelter and protection against the cold. This theme of sacrifice prompts us to consider what might have been next. If their ice floe had continued to shrink, or if they had encountered further obstacles, the couple might have faced an even greater dilemma. Would they have been forced to sacrifice more of their belongings? Would they have had to make the ultimate sacrifice, sacrificing themselves to save the other? Such a turn of events could have unfolded into tragedy. In the end, their survival against such odds is a testament to their courage, resourcefulness, and the strength of their bond. It is a reminder of the sacrifices we may be called upon to make in life, and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. Please subscribe to the channel for more tales of adventure from days gone by.